This is a recording for Canon Law I at Saint Meinrad Seminary in March 2024. We are in Lesson 6 on Penal Law. That lesson has 4 parts. So if you see the bottom of this page, this is the syllabus, and it starts with penalties, penal law, and the penal reform. We essentially have finished penalties and penal law, and our last class before our midterm, we got most of the way through the penal reform, Pope Francis's 2021 reform. And then the next section for us to do is 6b, particular crimes and penalties, and then 6c, application and cessation of penalties. We also have a 6d, the sexual abuse crisis, but as I mentioned the other day, I'm going to leave that reading probably for you to do on your own. It won't be tested on. You should do it because it's important, but you won't be tested on it, and that's kind of on your own unless you have questions about it. However, we're going to be about a class behind because we're not going to meet on the 22nd, the last day before Holy Week. So what I'm going to do is sort of trying to catch us up so that at our last class on Tuesday, the 19th of March, we can talk about the cessation of penalties, which is probably one of our most difficult parts. We're going to have another big chart on the board, so it would be nice to be able to do that together. So what we'll do on this video is finish what we haven't yet discussed about the reform. Then we will do 6b on particular crimes and penalties, and if the video isn't too long by then, we may just begin 6c on applications of penalties and cessation of penalties. Okay, so on the reform, we discussed that there are certain principles of underlying penal law, and really all of them were operable in Pope Francis's reform. Those principles are restoration of justice, reform of the offender, and the repair of scandal. One of the qualities of the reform is to have more determinacy and less discretion in the new penal law. That should be in your notes. We discussed that on March 12th, Tuesday. Also, we mentioned that more account is taken of lay persons, and we'll say more about that when we talk about specific crimes. And there's increased emphasis on financial crimes as well. We started talking about the specific changes, and some of the very welcome ones had to do with the rights of the accused. We mentioned that there's a presumption of innocence now, much more explicit than it had been, and also we have a clear standard of proof, namely moral certainty, which also is important. And a push to resolving cases more quickly. When I said, okay, now that's about as far as we got up to on March 12th. And then, of course, today, the 15th, we had our midterm. So now we're going to finish discussing the reform, and then we'll go into 6b, specific crimes and penalties. As I said, one of the keys to talking about the reform is there's more emphasis on the laity. The old law already made it a crime to attack the Pope or a bishop physically, an actual physical attack, or to attack a cleric out of hostility to the faith. Now, in addition, lay people have been added. So attacking a lay person out of hostility to the faith also now is a delict, which it was not before. Another sign of this new emphasis on the laity has to do with the penalty of suspension. We mentioned that there are 3 medicinal penalties, 3 censures. Excommunication and interdict are the first 2. And then the last one is suspension. That used to affect only clerics. Under the original law, it affected only clerics. Now that too can affect laypersons too. Of course, we're talking about laypersons who have some type of office or function in the church officially. Maybe a layperson who's a chancellor or something like that. What else is new in the Reformed law as of late 2021? We have some new delicts. Remember, delict is our canonical word for crime. So some new crimes. There's a new emphasis on patrimonial crimes. When we say patrimony, think of property. It's going to be a crime relating to church property, such as stealing ecclesiastical goods or transferring them without proper consultation. Also, if you are seeking ordination and you are bound either by a censure, a medicinal penalty, or an irregularity, if you do not disclose those things, that is a crime now. Now, what's interesting is that used to be a crime under the 1917 code. It was not included in the original 1983 code, but now it's back. It has kind of come back from the 17 code. We also have some new types of penalties. Fines. A fine is a possible penalty. It was not before. Also, deprivation of remuneration. So essentially, depriving what would probably be a cleric. It could be a layperson, I suppose, but it's usually a cleric. Depriving a layperson or cleric of their remuneration as a penalty, essentially of the pay for their work because they've committed some type of crime. Remission of penalties. Remission means the lifting of penalties. A new provision of the law says there can be no remission until the ordinary judges that the offender has repaired any harm that he caused. Very interesting provision there. The offenses against the 6th commandment. So we're talking about sexual crimes here, but these are crimes with an adult, not a minor. So this is Canon 1395. There will be a different canon on minors. It already was a crime to commit a sexual offense in public or by use of force or threats. It still is, but now something has been added. If you commit a sexual crime, sexual offense against the 6th commandment, and you do that as an abuse of your clerical authority, that now is a delict. We also would say that there's the kind of officials in Rome described the new law as having a much better organization than the old law. So we said kind of the general principles of canon law, the general part of canon law, the numbering of those canons have stayed largely the same, and a lot of the content is fairly the same. However, when we get to the specific crimes and penalties, the numbering is much different, and the content is more different as well. What do we mean by better organization? One thing that's really emphasized, if you hear someone who was involved with the reform talk about it, and they'll say, it used to be that abuse of a minor was categorized as an offense against special obligations, essentially saying the cleric has an obligation to celibacy, and committing an offense, abuse of a minor, violates the standard that he's holding him to. That's certainly true. However, what the new law does is it gives additional gravity to abuse of a minor by categorizing it now not as an offense against a special obligation, but as an offense against human life and dignity. So it's in that category, which kind of heightens the seriousness of it. Okay, that's the end of 6A, which was kind of our background part, our description of the need for reform, studying what Ratzinger, Arrieta, Iannone, and Pope Francis said. And now we'll look at 6B, particular crimes and penalties. I'm not going to mention them all. They're in your reading. You're reading this whole section. I'm going to mention the important ones and also the ones where you should know the actual penalty. There won't be a whole lot of those, maybe 7 or 8, something like that. And I'll try to give you a reason for why it's important to actually know the penalty. Okay, so the first category is offenses against religion and against the unity of the church. The first crime listed here, these are actually 3, but they're listed together: apostasy, heresy, and schism. Canon 1364, same canon number as under the old law. The penalty is a latae sententiae, excommunication, and a cleric who commits apostasy, heresy, or schism, he suffers loss of office by the law itself, and he may be punished with other deprivations too. I think this is good to know, the penalty here, because just this crime kind of comes up a fair amount. There are some other crimes against religion and the unity of the church, such as teaching a condemned doctrine, appealing from the Pope to an ecumenical council. I'll leave those for you to look at if you like, but we're not going to emphasize those as much. I think in this category, the ones you're really likely to encounter are the ones in Canon 1364, apostasy, heresy, and schism. Okay. I will mention one other one, though: public blasphemy or contempt for the church. That's Canon 1368, and the penalty there is a just penalty. I don't think I would ask you about that, but I would just mention that to kind of give you more of an understanding of what some of the other crimes listed here are. Okay, the next category: offenses against church authorities and the exercise of duties. We've already talked about this. Physical violence is a crime or a delict. If you commit physical violence against the Pope, the penalty is a latae sententiae, excommunication, reserved to the Holy See. Reserved to the Holy See means that, for the most part, in the ordinary course of things, it would be the Holy See that has to lift this penalty. The next category: physical violence against a bishop. There, the penalty is a latae sententiae interdict, but that penalty is not reserved to the Holy See. Now, when we're talking about attacking a bishop or the Pope, just the attack is a crime. When we talk about a cleric or a religious who's not a bishop, then it's only a delict if you attack or use violence against him or her out of contempt for the church. You're attacking this person, this priest, or this religious sister because you have contempt for the church. That's what's motivating you. And there, the penalty is a just penalty. As we said, the new thing that has been added with the reform is it's not only a attack on a cleric or a religious that now is punished with a just penalty, but also an attack on, quote, another of Christ's faithful. So that's going to now include laypersons. If you attack a layperson out of contempt for the faith, then that also is a delict. Other delicts in this category of offenses against church authorities: publicly inciting hatred against the Holy See or against your ordinary. And the penalty there is a ferende sententiae interdict, or other just penalties. I won't ask you that penalty, but I want to mention it so that you'll get a chance to hear where we've talked so much about late sententiae penalties. By talking about some of the others, you can hear that we have some other crimes that are not punished by late sententiae penalties. Here's one we have had come up in class: joining an association that plots against the church. It used to be that I believe that joining a Masonic lodge was mentioned expressly. That was changed in the 1983 code to talk about associations that plotted against the church. So for some time, for the first couple of years, the code was in effect. There's some confusion over whether Catholics now could become Masons, but the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a clarification there saying, no, it's still prohibited for Catholic to be a Mason. Here, that's a more general category: associations that plot against the church. The penalty there is a ferende sententiae interdict. I think you should know that this is a crime, joining an association that plots against the church. I would not ask you the penalty, though. And then a number of financial crimes are listed. This is a real innovation, and this would be Canons 1376 to 1376 to 1378, and it's several different financial crimes. Stealing ecclesiastical goods would be one. Alienating ecclesiastical goods, that is, transferring them without proper consultation, also would be a delict. And some other financial misdeeds: requesting an offering beyond the standard offering. For instance, for like a mass stipend or an offering, that if someone asks you what the offering is, you tell them what the standard offering in your diocese is. You don't ask for something higher than that. They might wish to give you something higher, and that's okay, but you may not request it. Also, abuse of office is the abuse of office was in the original code as well. Okay, next category, very, very important one: offenses against the sacraments. And here is where we're going to encounter most of the ones that you're going to want to be pretty familiar with the delict, but also with what the penalty is. So the first one is simulation. Simulation means essentially pretending to celebrate a sacrament, or purporting to celebrate a sacrament where you don't have the power to do that. Purporting to, we'll talk about some examples, but say a lay person or a deacon going and purporting to celebrate Mass and inviting people to attend, etc. Or even if he did not invite people to attend. So that's called simulation. For instance, a non-priest, purporting to celebrate the Eucharist. Also, a non-priest purporting to absolve sins, or purporting to hear a confession. Very important one: attempting to ordain a woman. If you attempt to ordain a woman, the penalty is a late sententiae excommunication. Back in the 1980s or 1990s, there were a number of Catholic clerics that attempted to ordain women. So this is punished by a late sententiae excommunication, and both the minister and the woman receiving the purported ordination receive the same penalty. Deliberately administering the sacraments to someone prohibited from receiving them is a penalty. Simony, we know of that from the New Testament, Canon 1380, essentially charging for the sacraments, charging money, or trying to profit financially from the sacraments. The penalty is a ferende sententiae interdict, or ferende sententiae suspension. I don't think I would ask you the penalties, but again, I want you to be aware that there's more to life than just latae sententiae penalties, even though we seem to end up talking about them a lot. Prohibited religious rites, Canon 1381. Offenses against the Eucharist, throwing away or showing contempt to the sacred species. That is Canon 1382, and that is punished with, this is, I think, important to know, a latae sententiae excommunication reserved to the Holy See. This would be a good one to know. Why? Because you could really encounter people who've done this. You know, you've heard of the rise of satanic activity. Well, this is what they do sometimes. Trafficking in mass stipends. When we get to Canon Law II and discuss holy orders, we'll talk more about mass stipends. But when they talk about trafficking in mass stipends, what they say is you're collecting mass stipends, but you're either not celebrating the masses or not making sure that someone celebrates the masses, or you're not exercising enough care to make sure that those masses are actually said. Okay, here's another very important one. A priest attempting to absolve an accomplice in a sexual sin. This is let's see, Canon 1384 under the new penal law. Used to be 1378. Penalty is a latae sententiae excommunication reserved to the Holy See. So again, in the ordinary course of things, the Holy See must lift this penalty. And so that's if a priest engages in a sexual sin with someone and then usually afterwards absolves that person, or attempts to absolve the person of the sin. We say attempt because that's an invalid act. That's invalid to attempt to absolve someone with whom you've engaged in a sexual sin. The only time it's not invalid is in danger of death. So that's an important one to know. Another one, solicitation. This is solicitation in the confessional, and that means that in the confessional you are soliciting someone, kind of encouraging or recruiting someone to engage in a sexual sin. Usually it means the priest is soliciting this sin for himself, for someone to engage in the sin with himself. But it could be another person. It could be soliciting the penitent to engage in a sexual sin with another person. In either event, the a very serious crime or an offense against the dignity of the sacrament of confession, and it's punished according to the gravity of the offense, possibly including dismissal from the clerical state. That would be a ferende sententiae penalty. Okay, another very important one, direct violation of the confessional seal. Also, this is punished by a latae sententiae excommunication reserved to the Holy See. Direct violation of the seal means that you have revealed both the identity of the penitent and also the sin. Also the sin. There's also a crime for indirect violation of the seal. And an indirect violation is essentially one or the other is disclosed, the sin or the person's disclosed, or the sin's disclosed and perhaps the person is mentioned in some way, maybe not by name, but in a way that people could figure out who it is. So again, direct violation of the seal, punished by a latae sententiae excommunication reserved to the Holy See. Consecrating a bishop without pontifical mandate. This is a crime that a bishop would commit. Also a latae sententiae excommunication reserved to the Holy See. Some crimes involving ordination, as we mentioned, ordination of ordination without proper demissorial letters. We had that come up in class the other day. And someone who comes forward for ordination, although they're bound by a censure, a medicinal penalty like excommunication or interdict, or by an irregularity, they are ipso facto suspended from the order that they received. So they're ordained because the bishop has ordained them, but they're suspended and cannot exercise their ordination. Okay, the next category of offenses is offenses against reputation and offenses of falsehood. The key crime here is the false denunciation of a confessor. What this is, we talked about the crime of solicitation. Well, this is where there was no solicitation, but you lie and you say, he did, my confessor did solicit me to commit a sexual sin. You see the terrible bind this puts the confessor in. He's bound by the seal. He can really can't defend himself in the normal way. So one of the things the law does to help with that situation is it punishes the offender. It punishes me if I falsely denounced my confessor, punishes me with a late sententiae interdict. So that means that I can't be essentially forgiven until I need to have my interdict lifted. But to do that, I'm going to have to repair the harm. I'm going to have to say that I'm going to have to make clear that I've unlawfully and falsely damaged somebody's reputation. Good. And that is Canon 1390, Section 3, where you're required to fix things if you falsely denounced someone. Okay. All right. Offenses against special obligations. We've kind of talked about this a little bit. These are things like when we talked about the clerical state, sort of a cleric engaging in commerce without permission, things like that. I don't think I would really ask you too much about this, though. A cleric attempting marriage, that's punished by a late sententiae suspension. Or a cleric living with a concubine, living in concubinage, essentially living as if he's married when obviously he's not. That's Canon 1395, Section 1, punished by a ferende sententiae suspension. Okay, next category, offenses against human life, dignity, and liberty. One of those, there's a crime of homicide or mutilation. That's Canon 1397, and that's punished according to the gravity of the offense. Procuring an abortion, Canon 1397. This is punished with a late sententiae excommunication, and it's been changed a little bit in the Reformed law. Now it makes clear that there has to be, the crime is committed when an actual abortion is obtained or performed. So I think it was already pretty clear from John Paul's encyclical Evangelium Vitae that this delict did not reach people like politicians, even though their promotion of lax abortion laws or permissive abortion laws was certainly very wrong. That's not what John Paul made it pretty clear. That's not really what this canon was aimed at. However, I think to make that even clearer, Pope Francis has said that what this crime consists of is in procuring an actual abortion. Okay. And as we already said, sexual abuse of a minor this is Canon 1398. This is now listed under the offenses against human dignity and life. And this is punished with deprivation of office and other just penalties. This delict includes acquiring or exhibiting pornography. And what's also mentioned is grooming. Now, there's, I think, this is still a fairly new provision. There's some disagreement as to whether grooming is itself a delict or if it's kind of an aspect of the delict of abuse of a minor. Woodall just wrote an article where he said a lot of people thought grooming was a separate delict, but it seems now like it's more kind of an aspect of the broader category of abuse of a minor. Okay. Okay, those are our delicts and our penalties. Remember, we also had this general norm that can be somewhat controversial that said you might be punished for things not with a specific penalty, but where you've committed some other violation that's not specifically specified with a specific penalty. That's still in the law. That's Canon 1399. It's kind of a catch-all provision, and in that sense, it's a bit controversial. I would say that I don't think that it is used very often. Indeed, the whole purpose of this reform of penal law was to get bishops, I think, and other leaders in the church to use the penal law more often. I think the Holy See's view was that the penal law was not being used enough, even where it should have been. Okay, that's the end of 6b on specific crimes and penalties. If you have questions, we can certainly talk about those. Let's go on, at least as for a few minutes, to talk about section 6c. Now, this is our section on application and cessation of penalties. What we really want to know here, we kind of have a pretty good, by just hearing about the penalties from 6b, kind of know how you incur a penalty. You commit one of these acts, and then there may be a process or a procedure to impose a penalty ferende sententiae, or if what you've done is punished by a late sententiae penalty, you've incurred that more or less automatically, though that may also be declared at some point. You may actually be informed that you have incurred this penalty. However, what we obviously want to know now is, especially in the case of medicinal penalties, well, how do we get rid of them? Once I've done something and I've incurred a penalty, how do I get out from under it? Who do I go to have it lifted if I qualify for that? It's going to depend on the type of penalty, and we probably want to think about basically 4 categories. So let me see if we can see this here. Depends on the type of penalty. Here's a little typology. Expiatory penalties, which are going to be imposed ferende sententiae, and then our censures. Our ferende sententiae censures, and then we have late sententiae censures, and as you know, they can be declared or undeclared. So those are kind of our 4 main situations, and we're going to want to think about how do we have a penalty that falls in those categories? How do we have that? I'm going to usually use the word lifted. How do we have it lifted? You'll also hear remitted. For a censure, you'll sometimes hear absolved. Those words are fine. I usually say lift just as a more generic category. Okay, so here's just some basic principles. We're going to talk about some basic principles, but the big thing that we're going to talk about when we get together on Tuesday the 19th is some important exceptions to these basic principles. In fact, some of the exceptions are so big they almost swallow up the rule. But for right now, we're going to talk about the main way, the presumptive way that you get a penalty lifted. If it's an expiatory penalty, it might depend on the type of expiatory penalty. If it has a time limit, you are commanded to live in the Pyrenees Mountains for 2 years. Well, once 2 years elapse, if you were imposed this penalty for 2 years, the penalty ceases by the lapse of time. Other penalties, like censures, especially medicinal penalties, they're usually going to cease. They're going to stop. They're going to be lifted by being remitted, by having somebody lift them. And that usually is going to be done in the external forum and by decree. As I mentioned, we sometimes say censures are absolved, while expiatory penalties are usually remitted by decree. Like I say, I'm often going to use this word lift. So some questions to keep in mind when we're talking about the cessation of penalties. What type of penalty is it? Is it reserved to the Holy See? Remember, when we say reserved to the Holy See, that means in the ordinary course of things, it's the Holy See that should be the one lifting the penalty. What faculties do I have from my ordinary? Do I have anything beyond what the law provides to all priests universally? And what faculties does the law itself provide me? So what faculties does the law provide me? And we're talking about kind of maybe like exceptional cases like danger of death. You can do things in danger of death that you couldn't do otherwise. Okay. All right, for declared censures and for expiatory penalties. So remember, expiatory penalty, will have been imposed by either a trial or an administrative procedure. So you know about it. You've gotten a sentence or a decree. And then there are declared censures. Remember, we said you might incur a penalty for, say, desecrating the Eucharist. And then when the church authority finds out about it, they notify you, yes, you have incurred this penalty because you desecrated the Eucharist, after they've done an investigation, of course, to make sure you're not being falsely accused. So if the penalty has been declared, or if it's an expiatory penalty, usually the ordinary who declared the penalty or imposed the penalty will be able to lift the penalty. Also, though, you could go, let's say you committed this crime or some crime in another diocese. Well, you could be subject to a penalty there, but then you go back to your own diocese. Your own ordinary also could lift the penalty, but he must consult with the ordinary who imposed it. That's Canon 1355. Canon 1355 is very important because for most penalties, it's going to tell you the ordinary way that penalties are lifted. Okay, but our big kind of problem is undeclared censures. We have all these latae sententiae penalties, so we can have all these undeclared censures, somebody who's incurred the penalty, but they have not heard from church authority. The church authority may not know about it, and maybe the person herself comes to realize, oh no, I did this horrible thing. I participated in this blasphemous ritual, and there was terrible mistreatment of the sacred species there, and I repent and I want to have the penalty lifted. Well, the bishop doesn't know about that, probably, and so the penalty is undeclared. What happens then? How do these penalties get lifted? If the censure is reserved to the Holy See, like desecration of the Eucharist, then the assumption that in the ordinary course of things, it will be the Holy See who lifts the penalty, and that's often going to be the Apostolic Penitentiary. Now again, stay tuned for Tuesday the 19th when we'll talk about some big exceptions to the usual rules. What are some other crimes where the Holy See, the penalty is reserved to the Holy See, so presumably in the normal course of events, the Holy See is the one to lift the penalty. Physical violence against the Pope is one. Attempting to ordain a woman, or a woman attempting to receive ordination, attempting to absolve an accomplice in a sin against the sixth commandment. Again, showing you what do these things have in common? Why are they reserved to the Holy See? Why are they punished by a latae sententia excommunication? That's going to be one thing to show us the great gravity of the penalty. But then when it's reserved to the Holy See, that's going to bump it up even further and show this is one of the crimes of the utmost seriousness. So attempting to absolve an accomplice, Canon 1384 is one of them. Ordaining a bishop without a pontifical mandate, also. Direct violation of the seal of confession. This is why I want you to know why direct violation of the seal is. It's punished by a latae sententia excommunication, and it's reserved to the Holy See. Why do you want to know this? Because especially in talking to people who might be not comfortable going to confession, or not sure that, or non-Catholics who aren't sure that the seal really preserves secrecy. This is something you can say, boy, if I do this, if I don't keep your secrets, if I don't keep your sins to myself, these are the consequences that the church puts on me. They not only excommunicate me automatically, but also even my bishop can't presumably lift the penalty. In the normal course of things, I actually have to go to the Holy See for that. And I think that there's sort of an apologetic use of your knowing that, even though I know none of you will ever do this, but just knowing that to reassure other people who might be nervous about the secrecy of the confessional. Okay, now here are some latae sententiae censures, most of them punished with excommunication, but they are not reserved to the Holy See. They're still very serious, but the bishop could lift the penalty. Apostasy, heresy, and schism. That was the first crime we talked about. That one, that's not reserved to the Holy See. It's a latae sententia excommunication, but the bishop could lift the penalty. Attempted celebration of the Eucharist, also. Attempted absolution of sins. False denunciation of a confessor. Abortion. You probably know that abortion is punished with a latae sententiae excommunication, but it's not reserved to the Holy See. The bishop can lift that. In fact, though, for a very long time in the United States, all confessors have had the faculty to lift the excommunication for abortion. And in the Year of Mercy, Pope Francis kind of on his own also seemed to give all confessors in the world that same faculty that the confessors in America have had for quite some time. Physical violence against the bishop, that's punished by an interdict, and by the way, false denunciation of a confessor also punished by an interdict. Most of these things are punished by excommunication, but those are punished by interdict. False denunciation of a confessor and physical violence against a bishop. But a bishop could, the diocesan bishop could lift those penalties. Okay, so some key questions to ask: is the censure reserved to the Apostolic See? If it is, then the normal thing is that the Apostolic See remits it or lifts the penalty. And if it's not reserved to the Holy See, you have to ask then usually that would mean that the diocesan bishop, or what's called the canon penitentiary in the diocese, would have the authority to lift it. However, you may have some faculties on your own. As we said with abortion, even though it's a very serious crime, latae sententiae excommunication, you are able to lift that penalty. And as we said, in the situation of danger of death, you're going to be able to lift penalties that you otherwise would not be able to. And we will talk also about the internal forum, and when you are able to lift censures that have neither been declared nor imposed. So not imposed, meaning not an imposed ferende sententiae penalty, and not declared. Somebody, think of the desecration of the Eucharist. Well, I know about it because I, unfortunately, say, hypothetically, participated in this blasphemous rite. So I know I did it, but church authority doesn't know that I did it, and nobody's really going to find out except you when I come to you and go to confession to you. So so that's going to be an undeclared late sententiae excommunication, and we'll talk. Well, I think we'll pick up there on Tuesday the 19th. We'll talk more about what happens in the internal forum. So key canons to keep in mind are 1355, 1357, and 976. 1355 will tell you the general rule for most remissions of penalties, and then 976 will give you one of the big exceptions, danger of death, and 1357 will give you the other big exception, which is called kind of the difficulty exception. If somebody comes to confession and finds it very hard to remain unforgiven while they're seeking remission of the sin, you're able to, in a way, conditionally lift the penalty on condition that they come back, and that you usually are going to be the person to petition either the diocese or the Holy See for the remission of this penalty, and we'll talk about how that's done. If you want to see where Woodall deals with it, he does it on page 483. Okay, thank you very much.